Mark and Elaine Richards were the picture of suburban perfection to loving parents. Their teenage children, Emily and Ryan, and Mark's elderly mother, Margaret, all living under one peaceful roof. But in a matter of minutes, their quiet family life was shattered forever. What appeared to be a tragic home invasion soon unraveled into something far more disturbing, a calculated massacre, carried out not by a stranger, but by someone they once loved and believed to be long dead. This is the chilling true story of how a vanished son returned, not for reconciliation, but for revenge, leaving behind a trail of horror hidden behind the walls of a perfect home. In a peaceful suburb nestled at the edge of Willow Creek stood a white-paneled house at 117 Millstone Drive. From the outside, the home looked like any other well-kept lawn. A pair of bikes leaned against the porch, wind chimes gently ringing with the breeze. It was the kind of place where nothing ever went wrong, where people left their doors unlocked and trusted their neighbors. The Richards family had lived there for nearly 12 years, and in that time, they had blended seamlessly into the quiet rhythms of the community. Mark Richards worked as a financial analyst in the city, commuting daily in his silver sedan. His wife Elaine was a part-time librarian, known for her soft voice and love of baking. Their teenage children, Emily and Ryan, attended the local high school, both honor roll students with clean reputations. Mark's elderly mother, Margaret, had moved in after a hip injury, rarely seen outside except during morning walks assisted by her wheelchair. Nothing about them stood out, and that's what made what happened all the more terrifying. Life on Millstone Drive was predictable, almost boring. Families exchanged greetings in the morning, children played tag after school, and the most scandalous gossip usually revolved around someone's lawn being overgrown. But on the morning of April 14th, the normalcy was broken. A local postal worker, who delivered mail to the Richards home 6 days a week, grew concerned after noticing the mailbox hadn't been emptied in several days. A week earlier it had been filled with birthday cards for Elaine's upcoming celebration. Now, those same envelopes were waterlogged and curling at the edges. More disturbing, a sour metallic smell seemed to be coming from the direction of the Richards garage. The mail carrier reported it to the police, more out of routine than fear. But that simple report triggered the discovery of one of the most brutal and puzzling cases in town history. Officers arrived just before noon. The house was locked, blinds drawn, and the family car sat untouched in the driveway. After knocking with no response, they gained entry through the back door, which was slightly ajar. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy and still. The air was thick with the unmistakable stench of death. Lights were off, but the flicker of a television echoed through the halls, casting strange shadows across the living room. The silence inside was not the quiet of sleep, but something far more ominous. Furniture was in place, dishes sat clean in the rack, and nothing was out of order except the bodies. What investigators would find over the next few hours would defy explanation and shake even the most hardened officers. 5 family members, all dead, no apparent struggle, no signs of robbery, no calls for help. It was as though death had arrived suddenly and efficiently, moving through the house like a ghost. The neighborhood that once felt so secure suddenly became a place of whispers and fear. The Richards home was no longer just another address on Millstone Drive. It had become the center of a nightmare that no one saw coming. When police officers stepped deeper into the Richards home, they entered a scene of haunting stillness. The only sound was the low hum of the television in the living room, left running on a children's channel. It was an eerie contrast to the silence that hung in the air, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards under their feet. The first body they discovered was Mark Richards, seated at the dining table as though he had simply fallen asleep mid-meal, but it was quickly apparent this was no natural death. His throat had been cut cleanly from one side to the other. The position of his body suggested he hadn't seen it coming. His hands were on the table, palms up, and the knife used to end his life was gone. Blood had soaked into the tablecloth and dripped onto the hardwood floor, forming a dark, dried pool beneath his chair. As the officers moved cautiously through the house, the discoveries only grew more disturbing. Upstairs, the master bathroom door was closed but unlocked. Inside, they found Elaine Richards submerged in a half-full bathtub, the water stained pink with blood. Both of her wrists had been slashed with surgical precision. A folded towel rested nearby, and there were no signs of a struggle. Her eyes were open, glassy, staring upward at the ceiling. The position of the body and the nature of the wounds initially suggested suicide, but the scene was too clean, too staged, and with Mark already dead downstairs, the theory didn't fit. Next were the children. Emily, 17, was found in her bedroom lying on her side as if asleep, but the massive trauma to the back of her head made it clear she had been killed instantly, likely with a blunt object. Her room was otherwise untouched, her textbooks were stacked neatly, and her phone sat charging on her nightstand. In the room next door, 15-year-old Ryan was discovered in a similar state. The cause of death was nearly identical, a single, crushing blow to the head. No signs of a fight, no mess, no defensive wounds. It was as though they had been taken completely by surprise. Both children were killed while alone, in the privacy of their rooms, with no time to react or escape. The final victim was Mark's mother, Margaret. Her wheelchair was found at the top of the basement stairs. At first, officers assumed she had fallen by accident, but the injuries to her skull were too severe and too deliberate. She had been pushed. She lay at the base of the staircase, twisted, unnaturally, her head split open from the impact. Investigators began to piece together a timeline and realized something chilling. All 5 deaths appeared to have occurred within a very short window, no more than 15 minutes apart. There were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints out of place, no weapons left behind. The house was locked from the inside. Whoever had done this had moved fast, knew the layout of the home intimately, and left no trace. It was not the work of a stranger or a burglar. It was something more deliberate, more personal, the kind of horror that can only come from someone within. As investigators dove deeper into the lives of the Richards family, they started with the obvious. Mark Richards, the head of the household and the first victim discovered. At first glance, Mark seemed like a typical suburban father, steady job, no criminal record, active in the local church. But beneath that surface, his life had begun to unravel months before the massacre. Financial records revealed a troubling pattern. Mark had been taking out multiple high-interest loans under both his and Elaine's names. Some were in default. Credit card bills had piled up. His accounts were nearly empty, and 2 weeks before the murders, he had been served a foreclosure notice. Strangely, none of this was known to his wife Elaine, whose own bank account remained untouched and separate. It became clear that Mark had been hiding the financial collapse from his family. As they dug further, detectives examined his work history. Mark had recently been demoted at his firm after a major accounting error cost the company thousands. Co-workers described him as increasingly withdrawn, jumpy, and prone to zoning out during meetings. Some said he had become paranoid, muttering under his breath and avoiding eye contact. Others noticed him spending long hours at his desk late into the evening, typing feverishly, but no one knew what he was working on. His personal laptop, recovered from the study, offered more disturbing clues. Encrypted folders contained files labeled with odd symbols, maps, and scanned documents, most of them tracking the movements of his own family. GPS records showed he had been following Elaine on her library shifts. There were surveillance photos of Emily and Ryan outside their school, and one particularly unsettling video file showing the inside of their home from a camera hidden in a vent. The most chilling discovery was a handwritten journal found hidden in a locked cabinet behind a false wall in the attic. In it, Mark had written hundreds of pages in erratic, fragmented sentences. Some pages were filled with lists of sins and purification rituals. Others referenced voices, shadows, and a repeated phrase, "They must be erased to make the bloodline clean." Investigators initially believed Mark might have been responsible for the murders, possibly in a psychotic break. But one major problem with that theory remained: none of the fingerprints on the murder scenes matched his. The wounds, especially those on Margaret and the children, suggested a left-handed killer, while Mark was right-handed. Even more puzzling was that the wounds inflicted on Mark himself would have been nearly impossible to self-inflict with such precision. Toxicology reports added another layer of confusion. Mark had been drugged specifically with a rare sedative only available through black market sources. It would have left him barely conscious at the time of his death. This pointed away from a murder-suicide and more toward an execution, yet no signs of forced entry, missing items, or struggle complicated the theory. Whoever had killed the family had known how to enter without being seen, how to manipulate Mark, and how to carry out the attack with surgical accuracy. Someone had planned this for a long time. Someone who knew the family's secrets, routines, and fears. Someone close.
3 weeks after the murders, just when the investigation seemed to be running out of leads, a twist arrived in the form of a flash drive found in a trash bin on the edge of the Richards property line. A neighbor cleaning out their garage had tossed an old storage box, assuming it was junk. Inside was the unmarked drive, which they turned over to the police, believing it might belong to the family. When detectives plugged it in, they found a single video file titled with "The Night of the Murders." What played next changed the entire direction of the case. The footage was grainy and dimly lit, captured from a motion-activated security camera installed in the basement. The Richards had never disclosed having such a device, and there was no record of them purchasing it. The camera had been hidden behind an air duct, aimed at the storm door leading into the house. At 1:27 a.m., the door creaked open, and a hooded figure slipped inside. They moved confidently, with no hesitation, as if they knew exactly where every step would fall. The person was dressed in black, their face obscured by the hoodie, gloves covering their hands. They paused briefly before climbing the stairs and disappearing out of frame. Exactly 32 minutes later, the figure returned. The front of their clothing was soaked in blood. They carried nothing. Their movements were calm, not rushed. They wiped the doorknob with a cloth, looked back once, then exited. But before leaving, something unusual happened. The figure turned to a mirror on the basement wall, perhaps left from when the basement served as a home gym years ago, and removed their hood. Though the lighting was poor, investigators could make out the angle of the head, the shape of the jaw, and most notably, a distinctive birthmark just below the left ear. The image was blurry but clear enough to match. That birthmark belonged to Daniel Richards, Mark and Elaine's firstborn son, who had been presumed dead 5 years earlier. Daniel had vanished during a solo boating trip at the age of 18. His capsized boat was recovered off the coast, but his body was never found. After months of searching, he was declared legally dead. The family had mourned, buried an empty casket, and moved on, at least publicly. But now, this footage suggested something unthinkable. Daniel hadn't drowned. He had disappeared on purpose. Facial recognition software gave a near match from the reflection in the footage, and police began tracking any digital trail that could lead to him. That's when they discovered activity on a long and active social security number linked to a property in northern Maine. A man living under an assumed name had been paying property taxes in cash and making regular supply purchases at small rural stores off the grid, away from technology, but not invisible. The case had turned from a puzzling family tragedy to something far more sinister. Daniel Richards, the lost son thought to be a victim himself, was now the prime suspect in one of the most cold-blooded mass killings in the state's history.
Authorities wasted no time once they located the property in northern Maine linked to Daniel Richards. The cabin was isolated, surrounded by dense forest, and accessible only by a narrow dirt road, barely wide enough for a single vehicle. It had no running water, no internet, and no cell phone reception. The structure was primitive but lived in, with signs of regular use. When officers arrived, they found it abandoned. Daniel was not there, but inside, they uncovered evidence that solidified the theory he had orchestrated the massacre of his own family. The interior of the cabin was cluttered with disturbing materials. One entire wall was covered with photographs, most of them featuring the Richards family. The images spanned years, some clearly taken from a distance, as though Daniel had been watching them from afar. In several of the photos, his parents, siblings, and grandmother appeared unaware they were being watched. Most unsettling of all, their eyes had been scratched out with red ink, and some of the photos were marked with phrases like liars, traitors, and purge. There were also newspaper clippings from across the state featuring articles about missing persons, unsolved murders, and tragic accidents, all pinned up in chronological order. Investigators would later confirm that 3 of the cases matched time frames when Daniel's location couldn't be accounted for. In a notebook recovered from a locked box, Daniel had written extensively about his belief that his family had abandoned him. According to his writings, Daniel faked his death to escape what he described as a poisoned bloodline and to begin cleansing the world of corruption, starting with home. His entries were erratic, filled with twisted logic and obsessive references to rebirth through violence. There were no expressions of remorseful and cold, calculated thoughts about control, destiny, and vengeance. Some entries hinted that he believed he was being guided by a higher force, suggesting possible untreated mental illness. Still, nothing in the journal offered a clear explanation for why he returned after 5 years, or why he chose that exact moment to strike. 2 days after discovering the cabin, law enforcement located Daniel Richards in a small town 70 miles away, using a false identity. He didn't resist arrest. During interrogation, he confessed without hesitation. He spoke calmly, describing in graphic detail how he had planned the murders, how he drugged Mark, how he waited for the perfect moment to kill each member of his family without alerting the others. According to Daniel, he wanted each of them to feel the weight of their sins in their final seconds. He showed no emotion, no anger, no sadness, just a hollow explanation of what he called a necessary ending. Daniel was charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder and was declared competent to stand trial. The courtroom was silent the day he entered his plea. Guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. To this day, experts still debate what truly drove Daniel to commit such a horrific act: delusion, mental illness, unresolved trauma, or pure evil. The Richards family, once thought to be the victims of a stranger, were instead destroyed from within, in a tragedy that unfolded quietly, shockingly, and with a darkness no one could have foreseen.